All right, here is 11b, the second part of 11, a little bit shorter, but oh well. All right, so we talked about GMOs being part of the Green Revolution, and here is why. Because when you think Green Revolution, you should be thinking greater output of everything, whether that's better irrigation practices, whether that's large-scale CAFOs, where we're getting concentrated animal feedlots, so it's easier to kind of mass-produce animals because you can have very specialized corporate design of the way you manufacture it. Or GMOs, where we're coming up with greater yield with less land, right? So that's kind of like the benefit of GMOs, is you're able to get increase in yield, and you're decreasing the amount of land usage, right? All right, we're reducing pesticide use because we can genetically modify these things to be resistant to certain types of bugs, but also since they produce more per plant, you don't need to spray pesticides all over the place, and you're reducing effects on human health as well. And we're obviously helping with world hunger because of the production of GMOs. Okay, concerns, safety for human consumptions. This can lead to decrease in demand for it, right? Especially if you go places like more liberal cities where people are a little bit more concerned about what goes into their food. There are some laws that require that if you want to put something like the organic food label on there, there's certified organic, there's organic, and then there's like guaranteed 50% organic, where products that went into the production of the plant, no more than a certain percentage can be or can be synthetic or commercialized or whatever. All right, but these are things that the government can kind of put into law to say that we can or cannot use GMOs for certain types of products, right? And so this is all kind of the things that get wrapped up into the safety for human consumption. There are effects on biodiversity because we do things like monocropping, where we use the same plant. And if those things escape, if the plants that are in a field escape into the local environment, then they can outcompete, right? They can outcompete the plants that are already there because they might be able to fulfill the niche a little bit easier than the native plants there, right? So they'd be acting as invasive species at that point. All right. And then we have regulations on genetically modified organisms, and some of y'all should remember that from when we did our Project Green Challenge at the beginning of the year. All right, farming meat and fish. We have CAFOs, and you saw this in the Food Inc. Large indoor or outdoor structure designed for maximum output. Again, when you're thinking Green Revolution, you should be thinking about maximum output. Fisheries, a commercially harvestable population of fish within a particular ecological region. And just imagine gigantic cages that go in the water, or nets that kind of have like boundaries that fish are grown in, right? And obviously, you're going to have some of the similar problems with CAFOs and fisheries as you would with monocropping, right? You're not going to have as much genetic diversity because the animal is not out there finding other populations of the same species and sharing genetic traits with them and things like that. We'll also talk about kind of this idea of fishing quotas, and like we talked about land usage and tragedy of the commons with cattle and sheep feeding on land. But you might remember the tragedy of the commons live we did with goldfish at the beginning of the year, where we basically depleted the ponds immediately, and then there was unrest in the entire population. So we'll talk about this idea of fishing quotas in New Zealand, and we'll watch a video on that. I'd recommend seeing that. I believe I have it in my playlist, but if not, I'll direct you to that. All right, fishery collapse, decline of a fish population by 90% or more, and bycatch is unintentional catch of non-target species while fishing. And so we have to have regulations that park rangers, wildlife management can check to see what you're catching in your nets to make sure you're not getting things that shouldn't be caught, whether they're fish that are too small, fish that are too large, fish that are out of season, out of style. I'm just kidding. All right. So global fish production has increased by more than 30% since 1980 as a result of large increases in aquaculture. This graph shows data for aquaculture-raised fish, and there are wild-caught and aquaculture-raised fish in global production. So this is just kind of something interesting to see. If you look at certain species of fish, though, like shows like the largest catch wouldn't have even been a thing we cared about maybe 50 to 60 years ago, but they're becoming increasingly harder to find large fish. All right, so let's look at some alternatives to industrial farming methods. The chapter opener that you looked at with that Joe Saltine is just one really good example of some answers you can put for more sustainable farming and agriculture. Industrial agriculture is now considered conventional. Okay, when cost of labor is not the most important consideration, traditional farming techniques may be economically viable. The thing to think about here is if you have a lot of machines doing the work that a man or a woman could do, you end up reducing your costs in the long run, right? So your overhead at the beginning goes up because you're investing in capital, but over time, like, save for the fact that that capital can break down. If you have some sort of machinery problem, it's going to save you costs in the long run. But when we're not looking at the cost of employing people for labor to tend to like your crops or tend to your animals, it could be economically viable, right? And we'll look at why, right? Instead of looking at the bottom line in the short term, we'll look at the environmental consequences in the long term and realize we can get a lot more money out of the environment if we try to preserve it as much as possible while we're using it to make a living. All right, so shifting agriculture. The land is cleared and used for a few years until the soil is depleted for its nutrients. So this is kind of something that we talked about with like rainforests and things like that. You just keep moving and moving and moving until you destroy the integrity of the soil, and that's called shifting agriculture. You end up getting desertification after a while, where the arable land becomes desert because you have taken the nutrients out of the soil. Nothing can grow there anymore, and because nothing's growing there, there's no root systems, and you end up getting erosion. All right, nomadic grazing, on the other hand, is when you move them around seasonally to productive feeding grounds over long distances, and this is usually because the place that you're at has low productivity. It doesn't have a lot of nutrients in the soil. Okay, so this is a nice, interesting map. Shifting agriculture and nomadic grazing. What do you notice? You notice maybe some of the poorer regions in Central Africa near the equator where we have a lot of rainforest, right? So we know that rainforests are not very, they don't have very productive soils. They don't hold their nutrients very well because of the amount of water that runs through the soil all the time, and also because it's so hot that things kind of decay very quickly, right? So we don't have like what we would have here, like boreal forests and things like that, where where things can kind of sit there for a bit, right? Deciduous forests and things can allow leaf litter to sit for a while and decompose over time, right? Okay, sustainable agriculture fulfills the need for food and fiber while enhancing the quality of the soil, minimizing the use of non-renewable resources, and allowing economic viability for the farmer. Okay, and here are some of the things that they do with that. Intercropping, we talked about that earlier. More than one crop there. You got synergistic interaction. We know that some plants release chemicals from their roots that bacteria use, and they might be beneficial to other plants. The three sisters is what the Native Americans used to plant. I believe it was potatoes, corn, and like maybe some sort of squash, and all those are beans, and all three of those things put together in their root systems would end up kind of synergistically kind of helping each other. So that's an idea of intercropping that people have been using for thousands of years, right? But if we use them, even though it might be a little bit more cumbersome for machines, right? So we intercrop, it might be a little tougher for machines to get in there and do their work very quickly and pluck all the fruits or vegetables out. But in the long run, it's a lot better. And this idea of crop rotation, where you put different crops in the same plot of land from season to season, just so that you are using up different nutrients and depositing different nutrients back into the soil. You're not just using the same plant that sucks up the same amount of nitrogen and the same amount of phosphorus all the time, right? And what's important to note here, if you actually grow stuff, is that not all plants should be planted in the same field, even in off-season. Let's see, potatoes and tomatoes should not be planted in the same plots of land very quickly, because diseases that might have taken out potatoes are also going to be able to take out tomatoes, since they are kind of related to each other. And so that's something to kind of consider as well. I don't think you ever need to go into the nitty-gritty of that, but just kind of knowing that fact and knowing that plants are synergistic in nature, that does help. All right, agroforestry is when you basically leave some of the wildlife environment intact. You know, instead of cutting down and clear cutting the oak trees in the place where you're going to put your crops down, you just leave it. You leave some of those plants there, and they help the stability of the soil that way. All right, no-till agriculture is a really, really big one. What does that mean? To till something, you're just digging in the ground and kind of loosening up the soil to kind of plant things. All right, perennial plants are plants that live for multiple years. Annual plants grow for only one season. These are going to be like our wheats and rices. What we try to do with GMOs is we try to find strains of plants that are closely related to annual plants, and we try to crossbreed them. I think we've done that successfully with maybe like a sorghum, which is one of the main grains of the world. And we're trying to do that with rice, so we don't have rice and wheat, so we don't have we're pulling plants out of the soil constantly. Like, it would be nice if we could keep them there, right? All right. And no-till agriculture is a method which farmers do not turn the soil between seasons as a means of reducing topsoil erosion, right? So if you keep it there and you just kind of put the seeds sow the seeds right into the ground, or you just at least kind of leave the soil intact, it's not going to blow away with the wind. And if you combine this with agroforestry, you really don't have as much of a risk of having soil erosion. You're also keeping the nutrients there. All right, integrated pest management. This is what we were talking about in the previous video. A variety of techniques designed to minimize pesticide inputs, right? And so we basically are just using the natural habitat will kind of find its own equilibrium on its own, right? It'll get rid of pests at great numbers. It's only because we're putting all the food that pets love, or not pets, all the food that pests love, that we're having these pest infestations, right? So if we kind of try to replicate the conditions that are not conducive to having lots of pests, then we can reduce them without having to use as many pesticides, right? So this idea of crop rotation, so that bugs that love to eat one certain type of plant don't know that they can come back every season, because you might give them something yucky that they don't like. Intercropping, this idea of kind of like putting plants around other plants that don't like one or the other plant. So an example might be putting marigolds up with your potatoes, right? Because some sorts of bugs don't like marigolds. They smell gross to them. And for a lot of humans, they might be kind of stinky too. So it'll keep kids away maybe. Planting pest-resistant crop varieties. So this is one of the things that's good about GMOs, right? Is you can kind of you can selectively breed for that and even genetically modify them in the lab. And you can create habitats for predators, right? Like allowing wasps and bees to kind of come in, praying mantis, spiders. Now, these things aren't really nice when you're employing humans to go pick things, but they do help reduce the amount of pesticides used, which do have a positive human health benefit, right? You're not being exposed to things like atrazine and glyphosate and things like that. Okay, effects of IPM training. Farmers in Indonesia led to significant reduction in pesticide application. They also occurred after training because the additional attention to the farmers gave to their crops. So if you think about it, if you're not just spraying pesticides like all over the place, you are a lot more interested to kind of make sure that there aren't any bugs there and you don't have a bunch of maybe like a potato blight going through, right? So, and again, you're reducing the risk of contamination of your water table and also exposure to this for the farmers. Right, organic agriculture, production of crops without the use of synthetic pesticides or fertilizers. So here's the principle: use ecological principles and work with natural systems. So you're essentially using a lot of poop, like animal poop and stuff like that, and biomass, or biomatter, like grass and wood chips and paper and stuff like that. Avoid the use of synthetic fertilizer and synthetic pesticides. Maintain soil by increasing soil mass, biological activity. So right here, this is important. We are talking about bacteria and also invertebrates, right? The bugs and stuff like that. And beneficial chemical properties, and these are the things we learned about these nutrients right here, right? And also the pH, right? The pH is very important as well. Remember that ion exchange, base ion saturation, all that stuff is very important for the transference of these elements. Alternative techniques for farming. So this idea of free-range beef and chicken is becoming increasingly popular. You go to the store, it's kind of hard to find stores that don't have like these cage-free, free-range meats that you can buy. It's more likely to be sustainable in the long run because you're not producing as much pollution you're not having as big of a carbon footprint directly through fossil fuel usage. But it does have some cons too. One of the really biggest pros is that you can take that manure that you would normally have to ship out using more fossil fuels to transport, and you can just use it to kind of fertilize your crops or fertilize the grasses, which ended up kind of being this reusable energy that the cows can then eat later. So that's kind of nice. The animals are less likely to spread disease because they're not in CAFOs, so they're not going to be in direct contact with animals that might be sick. So you don't need to use as many antibiotics or medications to kind of help the sick animals. So that's a way that you can economically reduce your costs in the long run if you think about it. On the other hand, though, free-range farming uses a lot more land because obviously they're roaming around all over the place, and the cost can be very, very high because you're not producing as many kilograms of meat per square meter. But you can offset those costs as a farmer by charging more money, right? You can charge more money because it's a free range, local, good for the environment, all that good stuff. All right, many countries in the world have developed fishery management plans with international agreements. The Sustainable Fisheries Act passed in 1996 shifted fisheries management from a focus on economically sustainable to a species sustainability approach. And when we kind of talk about sustainability in today's age, we're always looking at species and economics, right? So we're trying to see, is there an intersection between the two? So remember that. And this is kind of like the hallmark of more sustainable fishing right here. Individual transferable quotas, ITQ. That basically means, like, if I'm a big company and I'm allowed to catch, I'm just going to make up a number. If I'm allowed to catch 100 fish per season, and it's like, man, I used to be able to catch, there's a company that used to be able to catch 200, but now they're only allowed to also catch 100. Now they're all upset because they're only allowed to catch 100. But let's say I only catch like 25 in a season. Well, what the heck am I going to do with this other 75 fish? Well, I can take this and I can sell it to this guy over here for some sort of price. And so now the net loss of fish in the ecosystem is still going to be lower, but this guy gets to buy my fish for me and sell them somewhere else. So maybe my market, it wouldn't benefit me to catch 100 fish because I only have maybe 30 people. I might only have 30 people that want one fish per person, right? So if I have 100, it doesn't do me any good. It does me just as much good as having 35 or 36. So there's a marginally diminishing returns that I would get from catching more and more fish. But this guy, person 2, who's used to catching 200 per season, he might have a market where there's 150 people, right? So me selling him this extra 75 gives me more money, and it also gets this person the revenue that they were going to get, right? So that's kind of cool. So it's a system that works in places like New Zealand, and it tends to be a very popular approach to sustainability. So if you've ever heard, this is basically the same concept, but it's a different idea. CO2 cap and trade. It's the exact same idea. You're not catching CO2, but you're producing CO2 through your factories. And if you stay below your quota, you can sell your CO2 cap to somebody else, right? You can trade that cap to somebody else. And so they're still pumping out the same amount of CO2, but overall, globally, we've decreased it. So that incentivizes us to become a little bit more not just sustainable, but more efficient. Or if you improve your technology and your power plants and things like that, you can make extra money by selling the CO2 emission cap to somebody else. So that's kind of nice. And the same thing here. We become more efficient at what we sell and what we fish, and we can sell the extra stuff, or the stuff that we didn't sell to anybody. We can sell to somebody else who might have a bigger market. So you're not hurting the economy overall if you find a way to become more efficient. All right, aquaculture. Okay, farming organisms such as fish, shellfish, and seaweeds. Aquaculture involves constructing aquatic ecosystem. It requires keeping the organisms in enclosures. And there's a nice picture of this in your book that you should look at and take notes on. Proponents of aquaculture believe it can alleviate some human-caused pressure on overexploited fisheries and provide protein for more than 1 billion undernourished people in the world. Problem with this, one really, really big problem, is that it produces a lot of ammonium, kind of nitrogenous waste through fish pee, things like that. You have to get rid of this stuff somehow, and it's already in the water, so you're having like these really high concentrations of nitrogenous waste from the fish. But that can all be remedied by having trying to mimic and replicate the natural environment that would normally process that. Like maybe some aquatic plants. Aquatic plants are putting plants that can kind of uptake some of those things and assimilate the nitrogenous waste in the nitrogen cycle. These are all things to kind of think about and try to connect back to all the old stuff we've done. I've tried to do that as much as I could in these two videos, because we're starting to see in this point of the year that everything starts becoming related to everything. All right, good luck.